Welcome to the Creative Penn podcast. I'm Joanna Penn, thriller author and creative entrepreneur, bringing you interviews, inspiration and information on writing craft and creative business. You can find the episode show notes, your free author blueprint and lots more at thecreativepenn.com, and that's Penn with a double N. And here's the show. Hello creatives, I'm Joanna Penn and this is episode number 870 of the podcast, and it is Saturday the 27th of June 2026 as I record this at the end of a heatwave week here in the UK. It has been hot, that's for sure. In today's show, I'm talking to Nicole Walker about writing the hard stuff, how to turn difficult subjects into meaningful prose. We discuss how you can write about painful experiences in your life without being overwhelmed, and how timed writing and the idea of the braided story can help you untangle the most complicated situation you want to write about. So that's coming up in the interview section. In writing and publishing and book marketing things, on the Self-Publishing with Ally podcast, an episode about pop-up books, the production reality behind books that move, fold and function, with Kelly Anderson and interviewed by Anna Featherston. In an age of AI generation and digital marketing, we talk a lot about doubling down on being human and investing in high quality print products, and this is taking it even further into hand assembly, specialist printers and minimum print runs that make the economics unlike anything in standard publishing. Now, you may think, well, this has nothing to do with me. Well, I think it's really cool. Let's face it, pop-up books are just brilliant. And in this episode, graphic designer Kelly talks about building sculptural objects out of paper, like a record player wedding invitation, or her books, This Book is a Camera, which is an actual functioning pinhole camera, or This Book is a Planetarium, and other extraordinary pop-up contractions, which I just bought as evidence that podcasts sell books. If you can light up something in someone's mind. And Kelly says, we live in this highly advanced technological society where no one expects anything from paper, but paper, like everything else, is undergirded by the laws of physics, and you can build things out of paper that tap into that infrastructure. Kelly talks about doing a Kickstarter for one of her books when a publishing deal fell through and ended up raising over $250,000. So that's very cool. She also talks about the production process, because this is not just a print on demand situation. Books are constructed by hand. She mentions the Movable Book Society, which is an organization for collectors, artists and producers to share pop-up book information and art. She mentions specific YouTubers who do it, and just generally it's a fantastic discussion about something that made me smile, and I think is something that I guess we don't pay that much attention to because we're so, I guess, obsessed with the ease, I certainly am, the ease of self-publishing and print on demand, and while I love doing my Kickstarter special editions and all that kind of thing, this is something that really lights me up. And I do love pop-up books, and when I go to London Book Fair, which is almost every single year, there is a stand of a company that does this kind of thing, and I will often go over and have a look at what they've got. I love buying pop-up books. I used to buy them for my nieces when they were a bit younger. And I remember when I was young, there was a body book that you could open up layer by layer to get to the bones. And yes, you'd expect that from me. And in another life, I feel like I would have been an engineer or an architect or something. And actually, I haven't mentioned this before, but I am getting into adult Lego, and I am currently building Notre Dame, which has 21,000 pieces, and you build it in the order that Notre Dame was built. And I'm talking about the famous Notre Dame in Paris, obviously. And I'm partly doing it because I want to build the Sagrada Familia, which is Gaudi's wonderful cathedral, which recently finished in Barcelona. In fact, there was a wonderful launch video on, I guess it's all over the internet, where they lit up the cathedral and the Pope was there and it was awesome. But Lego are issuing a special edition, but it is a massive build project. So I thought I would have a go with Notre Dame first. Yes, I did try a few smaller builds, some of their botanicals range, but in terms back to pop-up books, I love the possibility. And I, of course, talking about all of this doubling down on being human, doing more in-person stuff, doing more physical stuff, doing more things with your hands. I just love this. So that is over on the Self-Publishing with Ally podcast. And then going back into the entirely digital in marketing things, BookBub have started a new promotional opportunity, new in Kindle Unlimited. And your book is eligible in the first 90-day period. It has to be full length, error-free and well formatted, which is some interesting language. It makes me think that maybe a whole load of error-filled and not very well formatted books have been submitted. But yes, has to be full length in KU. They say thousands of authors and publishers use Amazon's Kindle Unlimited to reach voracious readers who subscribe to the all-you-can-read service. But with many millions of books in the programme, getting your book into the hands of the right readers is an ever-growing challenge. We're launching our new in Kindle Unlimited email to help your book stand out. Newly enrolled books are hand-picked by BookBub's team of expert editors and targeted by genre to BookBub Power readers who are subscribed to KU, maximising conversions. Now, obviously, this is for books in KU, not for wide authors, not for pop-up books, not for print books, not for audiobooks, only KU ebooks. But another angle to consider, given that new books essentially disappear in the market now unless you give them some kind of boost. But then on the other end of the spectrum, and I love this, I love the choices we have as authors. Over on the productive indie fiction writer, Tracy Cooper Posey has a great series of articles about the solar sail theory of indie publishing. 8 articles about how you can build a solar sail for your author career, using the science fiction analogy of a spaceship powered by the sun with a huge sail. It exposes a massive amount of surface area. It continuously captures tiny forces, and those tiny forces compound over time. The metaphor essentially being that indie authors can build sustainable careers by maximising discoverable surface area across the internet and in real life, then channeling that attention toward owned reader relationships and direct infrastructure. And this is really what I've always done, to be honest. I think content marketing that stays out there for a long time. This is sort of the DNA of those of us who started in the mid to late 2000s at the beginning of blogging and podcasting and before social media took off. And of course, social media is ephemeral. So you post something and it disappears very, very quickly. Whereas, I'm not saying that's all wrong. I'm just saying it's those of us who started before it have a kind of different approach. Tracy says, your solar sail is every discoverable surface connected to your author ecosystem, which includes your books, but also other content that persists, like blogging or podcasting or videos on YouTube, which stick around long term, and stresses the importance of the email list and also personal relationships and how these things compound. Because the point is not immediate conversion. The point is expanding the size of the sail. Every piece of discoverable surface area increases the probability that readers encounter you somewhere, someday, through some path you cannot predict in advance. I agree with this, and you can obviously see it in action with this podcast, because while I do have an email list, most of you listening are not on it. And so I have no way of tracking how you found this show and me, or how long you've been listening, or what episode you listened to. I don't have any way of linking an episode to whether someone bought a book once. Maybe they never came back. Maybe they bought everything I've ever put out there. Maybe became a patron or bought a webinar or supported a Kickstarter or used an affiliate link or went to one of the podcast sponsors that I mentioned. But this show is certainly a form of solar sail, and it's part of the wind in my sails as an indie author. And so, yes, I love the analogy. And of course, you might get a faster launch with targeted paid ads, more like a rocket launch, as Tracy says, but it's only sustainable by burning more fuel, by constantly putting dollars into the fire of Meta ads or Amazon ads. And of course, now and again, a fiery boost might be worth it, which is kind of how I do ads in general, occasional targeted campaigns. But the sustainable career needs a much wider base. As Tracy says, the internet is entering a period of fragmentation. Search is changing, social media is changing, retail discovery is changing, AI content saturation is changing everything. In that environment, discoverability becomes less about dominating one platform and more about existing everywhere readers might encounter you, which requires a different mindset. There's little reason to obsess about virality, hacks, launch spikes, and algorithm chasing. Instead, you can focus upon far less stressful strategies like persistence, distribution, discoverability, ownership, and accumulated surface area of your solar sail. And actually, talking about the far less stressful, remember my book with Mark Leslie Lefebvre, The Relaxed Author. Take the pressure off your art and enjoy the creative journey, which essentially has a pretty similar approach to book marketing. But yes, that is a great series of articles over at productiveindyfictionwriter.com. I'll link to it in the show notes. And in fact, one of the articles in that series is on people are part of your sale and the importance of connecting with other humans, readers and writers and the whole ecosystem to keep your career going for the long term. And in fact, as proof of this, I read Tracy's blog because I met Tracy Cooper Posey and her husband Mark on the Oregon coast at a writers' conference with Dean Wesley Smith and Christine Catherine Rush a decade ago, back in 2016. That's also how I met T. Thorne Coyle, Kevin J. Anderson, J. Daniel Sawyer, who's actually on the show next week. And I got to know Mark Leslie Lefebvre more there and hung out with Lindsay Baroka and so many others. And those in-person connections persist years later, and my closest friends in real life are all writers now as well. So yes, go check out Tracy's articles on the solar sail and see if that really connects with you. In personal news, it was probably partly to do with the heat this week, but I decided to put my master's thesis on hiatus. I just need to do something else for a few weeks, write something you might find useful and that might actually make me some money. Also, there is only so long I can tolerate the dense academic writing without wanting to free my normal writing voice and write more freely and just generally write something more useful, because of course with most of my academic stuff, only one person reads it, and that is my professor. So I am so desperate to write something more useful. But anyway, it's been great, and I will, of course, circle back to it. Obviously, I need to finish the degree. Yes, I am pretty good at finishing things, so I will finish it. I know what my argument is. I've written a lot of it already, but I am now into the draft of how to write, publish and market short stories. I started this last year after I did a webinar on the topic, after I did The Buried and the Drowned, that collection. I learned so much about short story collections doing that collection, and also everything I've learned in more than a decade. I guess my first short story was 2014. So yeah, more than a decade now of writing shorts, publishing them in different ways, licensing them, repurposing them. And we always get obsessed with full-length books, but shorts are creatively wonderful. They can make multiple streams of income and be great for marketing. So I have started that. It's going to be a short non-fiction, probably 30,000 words, because I don't want to repeat myself from how to write a novel and successful self-publishing and all that. So it is going to be a short non-fiction, super useful. I've booked Kristen for edits, so I'm going to be done with that in July, and so that will probably be out August, September sometime. I will human narrate it, and it will be a useful craft and business book. And yeah, so I'm really pleased about that. I just feel so much more happy when I get words down on books I'm actually going to be useful to people. But as I said, I will finish that master's. Now, on Bones of the Deep, I've heard from lots of people who've now received the signed hardback, and the ebooks and audiobooks went out over a month ago. So that Kickstarter is completely fulfilled with just a couple of consulting sessions to go. And if you missed it, Bones of the Deep is coming soon in the usual formats, in the usual places, and of course my store, jfpennbooks.com. If you have read it and enjoyed it, a review would be much appreciated on Goodreads, if you review there, or my store, or wherever you usually review. This week I'm off on a research trip to Brussels and Bruges in Belgium, so keep an eye on Instagram at jfpennauthor or Facebook at jfpennauthor if you want to follow along. I worked in Brussels in the late 90s, and so it has some memories, but of course I was in my 20s back then, very different life. I'm also a finalist in the Selfie Awards for Best Self-Published Novel for Death Valley. The prize giving is at the Groucho Club in London this week. I'm in the last 5 people. Now, if anyone knows the city and the Groucho Club, that should be quite fun. If I win, you will know about it. If I lose, I'll probably tell you too. But yeah, it'd be nice to win that. I won that award for non-fiction for Pilgrimage a few years back. So it'd be nice to win it for fiction. Who knows? So thanks for your photos this week. Janet sent a photo listening to you while I set up my office in my friend's garden in Bavaria, and a lovely picture of Janet's camper van with the dog curled up in a cute basket under the shade of a tree, and her writing laptop and a chair. And I did actually think of you this week, Janet, as I was visiting some friends in Devon on the coast, went to their campsite, and there were some very swanky camper vans with people sitting with cold drinks in the sun and looked pretty idyllic. But I'm not sure my cats would be as relaxed as your dog. No other comments this week, so please leave a comment on the podcast show notes at thecreativepenn.com or on the YouTube channel, or you can email me. Send me pictures of where you're listening or your favourite cemetery or churchyard. Joanna@thecreativepenn.com. I love to hear from you. It makes this more of a conversation. So today's show is sponsored by Publisher Rocket, which helps you with keyword and category research on Amazon, which you need for your metadata when self-publishing, as well as generating lists of keywords for your Amazon ads. You can do this manually on Amazon, but it takes a lot more time and you have to think of all the different permutations to search for. I found that Publisher Rocket saves me so much time and frustration that I use it for every book in every genre I publish. It makes the process easy, which, let's face it, is what we all need so we can get back to writing. Now, some people have asked whether they could just use Claude or ChatGPT for this. And yes, they can give you lists of categories and keywords, but they cannot give you the detailed analysis that Rocket can, as it pulls directly from Amazon. So, for example, you can use the reverse ASIN search, put in the ASIN, the Amazon identifier of a book that is similar to yours, and get the categories and keywords that they rank in. Yes, you can actually look at where your comparison titles and comparison authors sit and what they are ranking for, and then it also gives you the number of searches per month for the keywords and how competitive they are in terms of pricing, so you can find some good little niches there to advertise your book. You can also search separately across different Amazon stores for US, UK, Germany, Italy, Canada, Australia, France, Spain, as well as ebooks, audiobooks or print, and in different languages: English, German, French, Italian and Spanish. So it's super useful if you're doing translations too. So yes, I still use Publisher Rocket for my books, and in fact I just used it for Bones of the Deep, which is out soon. It is a one-time payment and you get 30 days money-back guarantee, and you can start researching for your keywords, categories and competition right away. Publisher Rocket is one of my must-use tools as part of my publishing process, and it is very reasonably priced. So go check it out at publisherrocket.com. That's publisherrocket.com. This type of corporate sponsorship pays for the hosting, transcription and editing, but my time in creating the show is sponsored by my community at patreon.com/thecreativepenn. Thanks to the 7 new patrons who've joined this week, and thanks to everyone who's been supporting for months and years. If you join the community, you get access to all my backlist videos and audio covering writing craft, author business and AI tutorials. This week, I shared how to create audio and video snippets with AI and schedule them so you don't have to do them manually. The Patreon is a monthly subscription, the equivalent of buying me a black coffee a month or a couple of coffees if you're feeling generous. So if you get value from the show and you want more, come on over and join us at patreon.com, patreon.com/thecreativepenn. Right, let's get into the interview. Nicole Walker is a non-fiction author, essayist, poet and editor, as well as a creative writing teacher. Her latest book is Writing the Hard Stuff, Turning Difficult Subjects into Meaningful Prose. So welcome to the show, Nicole.
Hi, Joanna. It's so nice to be here.
I've lots to talk about. But first up, tell us a bit more about you and your journey into writing and publishing.
Yeah, so, I was always a writer, as all writers say. I was writing since I was 5. I had kept little journals and things like that. But I was on the high school literary magazine. I was an English major in college. But that was always tempered with some serious commitment too, to sciences, to English literature, to German, to Spanish. I had a wide variety of interests. But there was always something that tugged at me about writing that made me feel like this is where I feel most at home. And this is the way that I like to understand the puzzles of the universe. This is how I make sense of the world, is through writing. And so even though I got my BA in English at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. And I stuck around Portland for a few years because I loved Portland. And I worked for various nonprofits, and that was great. But at some point, I said, I really want to take this seriously. So I went ahead and applied to graduate school and ended up in the University of Utah's PhD program, where I stayed for 8 very lovely years. I always recommend to my own students, never graduate, stay in graduate school forever, because it's such a beautiful place where people support your writing. You have professors who support it, but more importantly, you have your cohort. And to this day, I have so many great friends. Again, you make a lot of friends if you stick around for 8 years. And that sort of community building is, I think, the other part of why I became a writer. Writing by myself, obviously, that's a lonely business. And there's a lot of internal struggle that happens with that. But to have found a literary community, both at the University of Utah and then growing from there, doing as president of the Nonfiction Now Writers Conference, to teaching my own graduate students, to serving as the series editor for Crux, the imprint at the University of Georgia Press, I feel like my world has expanded because of my writing. And so that's been a true gift.
Oh, I love that. I love that you said you understand the puzzles of the universe through writing and that you felt that this tugged at you. I wonder if you could maybe talk about that a bit more, because a lot of listeners, I think, sometimes mistrust that feeling and they think, oh, maybe I should not necessarily lean into that intuition. But it feels like you leaned very strongly into an intuition that this was the way.
Yes. And this book in particular, Writing the Hard Stuff, takes that to heart. So, for example, I think about writing the hard stuff as writing all kinds of tricky things that are really hard to communicate. And it begins to the book begins revolving around personal trauma, things that happen in my childhood, as well as difficult subjects that happen to us when we're growing up. But it also includes things like environmental issues and political issues, things that are really hard to talk about and are philosophically difficult to express and can be controversial, and you can put people off by talking about them. One of the goals of the book, one of my own philosophies, is that by looking deeply into the sort of knotted ball of string that is a kind of trauma or a kind of difficulty, and beginning to pull those strings out, that's where you start to not only make meaning out of what happened to you or what this particular problem is, but those strings itself become connections. I talk about Donna Haraway's books, Staying with the Trouble. And this is definitely a book primarily about how we can overcome our political differences regarding climate change. And one of her examples is to change the way we think about narrative. And in Western thought, we think often there's a beginning, middle, and end. And she brings up the Navajo game that we all know as Cat's Cradle. And so if you think of that ball of knots that you have, your trauma, your difficult subject, you start pulling out the strings and then you start playing with it. You start making, Cat's Cradle, you make one design with your hands and then a friend pulls it around and turns it into another design. To me, that's how reading and writing work, is that we share and we come up with each other's ideas, but we're always connected by those strings. So if you have this difficult subject and you're like, I am shying away from it, you're losing, I think, some of the opportunity to make connections and to make sense of what that nest of string sits around in your stomach is.
I love that metaphor. I think that's brilliant. And I've never heard it described that way. I think that's fantastic. But in my mind now, so I have, and I also, what's interesting is, of course, some people don't have a mind's eye. I know several listeners who don't have a mind's eye. So while in my mind, I'm picturing the ball of string and then I'm picturing the cat's cradle. Some people won't be able to do that, which is also fascinating, right? In terms of how people's brains work. But in terms of how perhaps you would recommend people think about it, this ball of string that we want to turn into a design like a cat's cradle, that ball of string is a total mess. So where do we even start? Like, how do we know where to start pulling on the threads? Because it might just feel like it's out of control.
Oh, I deeply appreciate both the idea that some people don't have that mind's eye or just think differently, right? We all have different ways of imagining what we call our trauma, what we call this nest of problems, that we call this ball of string. And of course, a metaphor does oversimplify in some ways, right? I'm like, well, you just take one of the ends of string and start pulling. But practically, right, what does that really mean to do? There's a couple of things that I suggest in the book and I offer at workshops, is I offer this exercise called writing the braided essay. And I ask the workshopee, right, the writer, to sit down and to think about, some scene that was difficult in their lives, something that had a lot of tension, that they really were still struggling with, that they don't love thinking about, but I'm gonna ask them to go there for just a couple of minutes. And then the other side of the braided essay is for them, I ask them to think about something completely different, completely off topic, perhaps a walk they took in the aspen grove, or perhaps what they were making for dinner last night, or perhaps they're deeply invested in the networks of the blood of the human body, right? Anything that they're sort of fascinated with and obsessed with. And I say, okay, so I want you to write about your difficult subject for 2 minutes, but then I'm going to give you a break. And you're going to pop over and talk about how you spent all day weeding your garden, and yet there's still weeds. And then I'm going to ask people to go back and talk about their difficult subject, and then go back and talk about their obsession with weeds. And they write about each of these things for 2 minutes. And what happens, which is, I think, pretty compelling experiment from my point of view and from theirs, is that they write back and forth, and they're able to take a break from the hard thing, but they are also tempted to go back to it once they have that break, once they've taken that break in their research. The other thing that happens, and I think this is, every book in nonfiction has to have a colon. So, of course, it's called Writing the Hard Stuff, Turning Difficult Subjects into Meaningful Prose, that these people are, that they take this story and by going back and forth, you'll see these connections that they make. They make connections with word choice, with verbs, with colors and different kinds of imagery. And what happens is they start to make meaning between those two ideas. And so what happened to the writer then is, and to me when I'm doing it, is I have now something that is constructed, right? So it is not just this knot in my stomach. It is not just my interest in research. Now I've put these things together, and then I get to play. And we get to the cat's cradle part of the metaphor, where I really start thinking about craft issues. Well, why did I happen to bring these two ideas together? What might they have in common? What does it mean that I am telling the story of my parents' divorce in my personal trauma, and in the research part talking about weeds? Well, maybe I felt in the weeds, right? You come up with some sort of overarching understanding of why you chose that research story. And it lets you go deeper into that personal trauma, now with some of the techniques of craft, which I think help shield you from some of the trauma and pain of that original hard story.
Again, I really love that idea. And do you also think that the timed writing actually helps people almost go deep and then withdraw a bit, which psychologically may help them write about these difficult subjects, which, you know, because people are like, oh, well, I need to sit down for 2 hours and write about this deeply traumatic thing, which of course you feel like this is going to be too hard. So perhaps that 2 minute sort of process actually releases people from that.
Oh, absolutely. What a great way to think about it is that it is prohibitive to sit down and think, okay, I'm going to go into the worst thing that ever happened to me and sit with it for 2 hours. I think, yeah, going back and forth, you do get, and you create energy too and tension, but also nobody wants to sit with something by themselves for 2 hours. If you think of research as your companion, like I'm coming in there with you, buddy, that you have somebody to rely on, something to rely on, this other side of the story. It also gives you that space. And it also, the timed writing, the 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes, that process reminds you too, that you don't have to write for 2 hours straight any day, right? I have a goal where I write 500 words a day, which is mostly true unless I'm really in the weeds. We will use two metaphors for today. We will use bowstring, and now we will be using weeds. But whatever, really in the weeds, teaching or going around the country talking about books, I really do write 500 words a day. But I often try not to write too much more because I feel it sometimes loses freshness and it can be overwhelming. And so I really appreciate your saying that having that timed writing is important, but also having that balance of deep emotional investigation with this more cerebral, informational crutch can really help you get into that subject and to go deeper.
Yeah, and also perhaps it anchors the writing in something concrete, because with memoir, particularly having also written one, it can be too easy to lean on big words like pain or trauma, but that actually is meaningless in a book, right? So why is it so important to be specific and concrete around our writing in order to display these bigger topics?
Well, I think we know our own trauma. We know how it feels in our bodies, and we've been living with it for a long time. And so I think it's pretty hard to communicate it to others. Why does it matter to other people? Of course it matters to you, right? But how are you going to convey that breadth of that trouble with words that are not rooted into the physical world? And the nice thing about rooting things in the physical world is every one of us has a body, right? We have different bodies, but we share that in common. And so it's the old trope of using your senses first. What did it feel like? And if you can't think of what part of your body it particularly hurts in, you have the availability of metaphor to describe how that might have felt in your body. You have the opportunity to create scene. And this is really, I think, particularly difficult for memoir writers because we imagine that it's the fiction folks, right? That have to use dialogue, that have to have a setting, put our bodies in a place. But that's one of my mantras that when I teach, I say, we need to be able to see where you are. We need to see what is physically happening, how the interactions work. And dialogue, I think, is one of the best ways to literally get your body on the page and to get your other characters / subjects on the page is to put them in dialogue, because to speak, you have to have a body. And once you start having dialogue, you can picture the way the speaker's face moves, the way they cross their legs. You can even picture the color of the paint behind them or the kind of chair they're sitting in. So dialogue is one of the first ways I think you can say, all right, I must have a scene here. I can't go on telling people it was so traumatic. I suffered so much. It was terrible. I felt so much pain, right? You could say that sometimes. That's totally fair. But you have to pair it with that physical, as you said, concrete imagery, so other people can begin to understand what it felt like for you in your body, so they can feel it in their body.
Interesting, though, you bring up dialogue, because one of the issues with memoir is, I've had people compare it to truth with a small t and truth with a big T. So you're sort of telling some kind of big truth about your life. But if you're writing dialogue about something that actually happened to you in memory, it's very, very unlikely that that actually happened in that way. So it's not necessarily small t true. So on a practical note around writing this kind of thing, what are your thoughts and tips on truth, and how do we tell our own story even if others don't see it that way?
Yeah, this is a subject that I'm deeply invested in right now because when I first started teaching creative nonfiction, it was at the height of the John DeGata and David Shields big questions. What is truth? Big T, little t. What am I obligated to do as a creative nonfiction writer? And I had this great friend, Angie Chuang, who came to teach one of my classes. And she said, nonfiction is a pretty big spectrum. You have journalism on one end, and then you have the lyric essay on the other end. And you imagine the lyric essay is full of metaphors and things like that. So you can approach truth, right? You're like, this is what it felt like. This is what it seemed like. But check out my newest favorite thing. It's called speculative nonfiction. And I use a little bit of this in my book, How to Plant a Billion Trees, which Writing the Hard Stuff is somewhat based on. I wrote them in tandem, which is a very strange and it was a very interesting and fun thing to do. But in How to Plant a Billion Trees, I use this thing called speculative nonfiction, which goes then even further on the spectrum past lyric essay to this opportunity to use language like perhaps, maybe, I imagined. So I have sections in my book where that I can't remember the dialogue, right? Exactly. But I know that the dialogue in some sense matters, right? That what might have been said will do much more to convey what was happening than my exposition over the matter. And so by using those turns of phrases, right, that you're alerting your reader, dear reader, yes, this definitely is not exactly what happened, but this is how I recall it. Then you're being not only honest to the story and honest to your reader, but you're also conveying the feeling and the mood of the event, that other kind of truth that Memoir is really trying to get at, right? It was like this for me, which is why I think this way now. And it's kind of a fledgling genre. I just read a book by Lorraine Herring called A Constellation of Ghosts, a speculative memoir with ravens. It's brilliant. It's an amazing book that pairs her fear with her actual colonoscopy and then discovery of colon cancer with the story of her dad who has passed already and comes back as a raven and helps her through it. So you're pulling on some of the tools of fiction, which creative nonfiction already has been doing, but it does so in this bright and I feel like incredibly ethical way. You're alerting your reader, yeah, my dad is not really a raven, but you're saying, oh my gosh, I sensed he was with me. I sensed every time a raven approached that I had somebody's hand on my shoulder. And that to me has been a lot of fun and a much more imaginative way of creating some of those scenes than doing something like, well, I don't remember the dialogue. Or even worse, we know people have been unethical in their approach, is recreating the dialogue as if they had a tape recorder with them when they were 17 years old. So I offer that as an option to your listeners as something to experiment with. Allow yourself to have that imaginative opportunity to show the reader what it might have been like.
Yeah, I love that. And it's interesting, you kind of talk there about the spectrum of, let's say, non-fiction, which, is ridiculously big, as is fiction. Obviously, these are very, very big. But I wonder if we do get hemmed in by genre. I love the idea of speculative memoir. I'm going to have to go read that book because I can't even imagine what that really means because I feel hemmed in by my expectations of a memoir. But then from a business and marketing perspective, because we're all trying to sell our books, do we risk not meeting the expectations of a reader of a genre that way?
Right. I mean, so one of the good and bad things about my literary career is that I've spanned a lot of genres. My PhD is actually in poetry. Nobody expects the full truth from poetry, or if they do, one of my poetry professors once said she wrote this really sad poem about her father's death, and the audience was moved. And then her real father stood up and said, "Good job, daughter." And someone in the audience was just shocked, like, "You just read a poem about your dead dad, and here he is." We have absolute expectations of genre and expectations of truth in everything that we read. If you label it fiction, right, you're kind of off the hook, even though, of course, fiction uses so many elements of nonfiction, right? So much research, so much information, so much personal memory to create these fantastic landscapes. So when I think about how one sells one's memoir, right, I do think you also have to acknowledge what you expect your audience to be. So Lorraine Herring's A Constellation of Ghosts, her book, she by putting colon a speculative memoir, you're alerting your reader to that possibility. And because it's a pretty far out way of thinking right now, it does probably curtail some of the sales. But on the other hand, think of memoirs that are written for celebrities, and how many of them are ghost written, right? Or written with other people. And that ghostwriter is not even part of the thing, but it comes across as the most legit of all memoirs because it's a celebrity and we know them. And so we associate their lives with their story, and their story must therefore be true. So I think with all levels of creative nonfiction, that it is incumbent upon the writer to, right off the bat, suggest what kind of nonfiction they're reading, right? Are they reading journalism? Are they reading lyric essays? Are they reading speculative nonfiction? And I think a lot too about, as an editor for a literary series for nonfiction books, what do I look for in memoir is something that takes the personal story and connects it into the larger conversation, right? And even if the larger conversation is directly about what the main subject is about, it's still, to me, about the crux of the matter. Why does your story make an impact on the world in this bigger way? How do you let the world inform your story? How does your past and your trauma or your difficulties connect to a larger world? To me, that's something that some memoirs are capable of doing, right? And some memoirs are truly invested only in that personal story, which I think is totally legitimate too, because I love learning how people think. I love understanding. This is just how my brain works. But in terms of sales, I don't know. Again, as the series editor and seller of my own books, I sort of think you can't determine it in advance. So you should probably write what you want to write and what feels right to you, using as many, of course, craft techniques as you can hone. But the market, to me, feels is very, very non-negotiable, right? In that, I mean, you'd never know exactly how things are going to turn out. So, so I believe, I deeply believe, write the best, well-crafted book you can, and I do think your readers will find you.
Well, we'll come back to marketing in a minute, but just returning to your own writing practice, I've got your book page up in front of me, and you've written all kinds of things, your essays, your memoirs, some fiction and some poetry, as you mentioned, and you've got all kinds of things. And so I wondered, how do you know when you're coming up with, you're researching something or you've got a feeling about wanting to write, how do you choose the type of book that you turn it into, or a poem or an essay, or you pitch it as some kind of external work, or turning it into a workshop? Or how do you turn an idea into what it will be eventually?
I love that question because it is somewhat of a mystery to me, but I think getting close to understanding, it really is in those first few words, that first sentence, that I'm like, okay, I know which direction this is going. For example, the other day, I woke up in the morning, I'm like, all right, I'm writing this poem about how man took over for God, and that's how the planet ended up to be such a mess. And so I started writing it, and it was pretty lyrical at the beginning, but then I started making full sentences and I started explaining things a little bit more. And I was like, okay, this is not a poem. It's going to be an essay. And then when I start writing fiction, I pull on something, I think, a little further, a little more distant from my experience. And then I pull it back into something more character driven. So, for example, in a novel I'm writing, I begin with this whole story about McDonald's and ravens, and then I pull it back into the character. But really, if I were to diagram the sentences between a poem and the nonfiction and the fiction, I think I would see fundamental differences between the three.
And do you work on multiple projects at the same time, or do you start once you commit to something? That's what you finish. I mean, personally, I have lots of things, lots of little things happening. And then it's like a moment comes and I commit to a book, and then I will not stop until I have finished that book, and the rest of them will have to wait. But it's sort of that decision moment. How does it work for you?
Yeah, my process is pretty similar to yours. I have a number of projects ongoing. They're like percolating here and there. And some days I'll be, all right, today feels like a fiction day. But for the most part, you're absolutely right. Like there's a bunch of little things I'm writing or these things I'm dabbling in. But once there's a critical mass, right? Which I would think is around, I'm going to say 20,000 words or something. Like I'm all in and I've got to focus on this project. Plus, even though whatever multitasking I think I can do, really it's important to try to maintain some sort of through line in whatever project I'm working on. And if I do that too much with too many projects, I lose that through line. I also worry sometimes too that the projects start to sound too similar. So say I'm writing a nonfiction collection and writing a novel, that if I go back and forth every other day, that those sentence differences that I'm talking about might start to collapse and they become too similar. And then what the heck would I be writing? I don't even know.
Yeah, and then it's interesting because you span academic publishing and I guess trade publishing, whatever you want to call it, when more non-academics read books. And I'm just finishing up a master's myself at the moment. And so writing academic stuff is completely different to writing my other books. And I wondered, so when you're deciding on these books, are you aiming for a specific publication market, as in you want an academic publisher or you want a trade publisher, or how do you think about publishing in the process?
I think that I would say that as much as I once really wanted to find some ground as a scholarly and academic writer, and I really do love to write reviews of other people's books, and the writing the hard stuff is a textbook that relies tremendously on so many other people's books. That's really important to me because, again, that goes back to how one both creates and thanks one's community for creating this literary world that we live in. But I feel like there's a smaller audience for that sort of academic writing. But something that we should do, we'd really, as generous as you are here, for example, reaching out to other people about other people's books is probably the kindest thing you can do. So I hope to continue to take time to do that and make that part of my repertoire. But it is not as fun, I would say, as the imaginative elements of writing creative nonfiction or fiction or poetry. And that's when I love to groove and get in that mode of just like, oh, the words are coming. Oh, I never thought about it that way. And academic writing, I feel sometimes I write in a little bit more stilted voice. My friend Andrew Munson, who teaches at University of Arizona, he's done this really great job of writing, whether it's his personal essays or critical essays, where he maintains his same voice. He doesn't move into that super formal academic speak. He literally will say things like, or that's a banger of a sentence in the middle of an academic essay. And I really admire him for that and feel like maybe if academic writing was more receptive to people writing in their unique voices, then maybe more people would read it.
Yeah. One of the feedback on one of my earlier essays in my master's year was around my sentence structure and that it would be far more appropriate in a novel than in an academic essay. And I was saying to my husband, I can't believe this, but I'm just going to have to change my style. So yeah, it's very interesting. But we're almost out of time. But I did also want to ask you, you have a blog post, a recent blog post on how to try to get your forthcoming book attention in 4,231 simple steps, which made me laugh. And so we all find book marketing a challenge. So what have you found works best for you? And I should tell the listeners, there are not 4,000 steps in your blog post, although I think people would want them.
Exactly. I stopped at 72, but I can go on. That was sort of the pre-publishing process. And there's been so many great things that have happened, but a lot of them have been driven by me. I have a publicist, but he works on a lot of other books, and I have a marketing person at Bloomsbury, but they have to juggle a lot. The only person that's really, really, really committed to your book is you. And so I've written companion essays. I have not had any luck publishing them. And that hasn't been true in the past. And so I wonder what's going on in that, I'm going to write something for the Huffington Post or Newsweek that is tangentially related to my book. I also might just write too much in essay voice instead of popular magazine voice, as we were just talking about academic voice versus novelistic voice. So that might be part of the problem too. Reaching out to people who might invite me to podcasts has been really rewarding and very, very, again, very, very kind. I think the best thing I did, though, was to put myself on book tour and to pair myself with someone in that community. I've gone on book tour before by myself, and there are occasions where there have been two, three people in the audience, and that can be really disheartening. And I think the problem wasn't so much at the bookstore's fault or my book's fault. It's just that if you go to a bookstore in a town where nobody knows you, they're not going to put a lot of effort into making the date, right? Unless you're super famous. And so what I did is I found somebody in a community, a friend of mine, who would go with me and be part of the conversation with me. And we would both, even if their book was a couple of years old, we would still go and have a conversation about each of our books. And this has worked tremendously well. People will come to see their friend, and then they'll be introduced to you, and they will ask you questions and buy your book, and you will create new connections and new friends thanks to that friend in that place. So that's my number one recommendation of how to get the word out in the world. And I did all the social media stuff. It doesn't work as well as it used to. It's kind of a strange time. But but because of my suggestion about going to bookstores with people I think we're coming out of our COVID time where we're so used to just doing everything on our computers and just staying in our electronic universe. People are hungry to get out. So one thing I want to do and haven't done yet is throw a big party. Go to weird places where you don't even do readings. You just offer people snacks and a glass of wine and say, "Hey, here's a book. If you want to buy it, right on." To have these more informal gatherings that bring people together, because I do think there's a hankering for people to get out into the world again.
And just on that, you've got these two books at the same time, the How to Plant a Billion Trees, which is the memoir, and then Writing the Hard Stuff, the how-to book for writers. When you do these events, are you choosing one or the other depending on the audience, or are you kind of selling both at the same time? Because they're very different.
Yeah, I'm definitely selling both at the same time, although How to Plant a Billion Trees is probably, I push that first because most of the people I'm pairing with are also writers of nonfiction or memoir. And the other thing is I can talk about How to Plant a Billion Trees. And if people have a really deep question about, well, how did you write this section? I can say, well, if you refer to this book, Writing the Hard Stuff, you will see. So it's an easier segue, for example. And I think people are not used to going to book events for books, craft books. But in the interview world, right, where people are reviewing books or interviewing me, definitely writing the hard stuff has been the primary book I've been approached to speak about because people really do want techniques, right? So it depends on the context of which book gets the spotlight, but it's been really fun to be able to talk about both in tandem. And I don't know if they're competing against each other or if they're supporting each other. That's my hope, is that they're like, oh, I read this one book, I might as well read the other one. But that's asking a lot of people to buy 2 books. So I try not to overstate that hope.
Yeah, but no, they are very different. And I love the idea of doing that. Absolutely. So where can people find you and your books online?
Well, you can find me more at my Substack, which is substack.nickwalk.com, Nikwalk, or my website, which is the same, Nikwalk. I might just start going as Nick Walk in the world so people can find me more easily. And I really love to support. Bloomsbury has really good deals especially on the audiobook for Plant a Billion Trees. And they also have good deals. If you buy both books, you get free shipping. So Bloomsbury is probably the number one place to get the books. But of course, they're available on bookshop.com and Amazon.com, and Amazon in the UK as well.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much for your time, Nicole. That was great.
It was so fun to talk with you, Joanna. Thank you again so much for this opportunity.
I hope you found the interview with Nicole interesting and that you might try timed writing or the idea of the braided essay approach, or for book marketing, you might consider pairing up with other local authors for in-person events and double down on being human. You should probably just take a drink whenever I say that now. So let me know what resonated with you. Please leave a comment on the podcast show notes at thecreativepenn.com or on the YouTube channel, or email me, joanna@thecreativepenn.com, and send me pictures of where you're listening or your favourite cemetery or churchyard. Next Monday, I'm talking about author voice mastery and rebooting an author business after a hiatus with J. Daniel Sawyer. So happy writing, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening today. I hope you found it helpful. You can find the backlist episodes and show notes at thecreativepenn.com/podcast. And you can get your free author blueprint at thecreativepenn.com/blueprint. If you'd like to connect, you can find me on Facebook and X at thecreativepenn, or on Instagram and Facebook at JFPennAuthor. Happy writing, and I'll see you next time.